The reading wars. Yes, there really were reading wars, which proves once and for all that people will fight over anything. They can't even agree on how to teach kids to read. It's sad. That's how we are. You're thinking, does my local librarian Rambo out on the weekends? That's a cool idea, but no. People are still fighting this war, but because they're nerds, they're fighting it with pencils and textbooks instead of bullets and missiles. So don't get your hopes up. The reading wars have taken place over many generations now. This latest battle has kicked off with the very popular podcast called Sold a Story by Emily Hanford. I heard about that podcast through a YouTube video by Teacher Therapy called Why Kids Can't Read or Behave. Can we just talk about this title? It is perfect because we've all asked ourselves, look at these kids. What is wrong with these kids? They can't read, they can't behave, they are useless. But apparently every generation has said this. Which is fantastic. Our parents were looking at us like, these kids can't read and they can't behave. And their parents were too. It's so beautiful. Anyway, all kidding aside, after that, I started to dig deeper. And the more I learned, the more frustrating it became. Why fight over teaching kids how to read? Okay. But then I looked at the statistics and I had even more questions. So who is fighting these reading wars? Who are the combatants? We have Phonics in the blue trunks, and we have whole language in the red trunks. We all remember Hooked on Phonics. You remember those commercials, the Hooked on Phonics commercials? Phonics is basically learning to sound words out. Sound it out. There are 26 letters in the English language and 44 sounds. So when a child learns to read through phonics, he or she is being taught how to decode the letters in the word. They learn the sound that each one of those letters makes. So let's say phone. You might be watching this on your phone. Phone. PH sounds like F when put together. Long O because E at the end of the word, and we don't pronounce the E. Phone. Phonics. Whole language teaches children to read by teaching them the whole word. They're just supposed to know that the word phone written is symbol for the word phone. Their argument is that English has so many exceptions that children are best off memorizing words. That is not how I learned, and it really confused me. It really did. There are foreign languages where the word is a symbol written, and people are meant to memorize all of these symbols. But our language is phonetic, which means it's made up of letters which make sounds or phones. To me, it's obvious that you teach a phonetic language through phonics. The words are already there, right? It sounds like the word, huh? Now, whole language advocates will say that reading is natural and children will just pick it up on their own, just like speaking. You just expose them to enough words and they'll figure it out. They'll figure it out. Well, that's not how we learn to read. That is how we learn how to speak, but it's not how we learn to read. Someone has to teach us because reading happened so much more recently in the history of human evolution. We actually have to rewire some parts of our brain to do it. It's a process that has to be taught. Think that humans control fire. It's kind of our thing. We're kind of cool like that. We cook our food. It's also a plot point in the Jungle Book. If you remember the song, I Want to Be Like You, where King Louie is singing that he wants to know the secret of man's red fire. But Mowgli, he doesn't know it because he hasn't been taught how to make fire. So starting a fire and reading are the same in that way. They are skills that need to be taught. So don't take my word for it. Please don't take my word for it. You remember reading Rainbow? Don't take my word for it. Anyway, that's so stupid. Don't take my word for it. The science is pretty much settled. Kids learn how to read through phonics. Now think about this. If you learn to read a foreign language, the first thing you learn is the alphabet. No, you will not just pick up Hindi by looking at enough Hindi. You're just not going to learn it that way. If you watch a lot of Bollywood with the subtitles, you might put it together that some letters make some sounds, but that's still phonetic learning. You just took the hardest possible way to get there. Still fun. It's probably still fun. I'm not going to stop you. Look, humans never deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics just by staring at them. And there were pictures everywhere. The pyramids were just sitting there for a long time, full of hieroglyphs, and no one put it together until they had the Rosetta Stone to decode it. Decode is the word here. Now, whole language encourages children to use context clues or cues to find the meaning of the word. Whole language in its current iteration is known as cueing theory. Here is a quote from Emily Hanford. The most important thing was for the child to understand the meaning of the story, not the exact words on the page. So if a kid came to the word horse and said house, the teacher would say it's wrong. But, Harper said, if the kid said pony, it'd be right because pony and horse mean the same thing. What? So teachers are reading kids stories with pictures and asking, what's this word? And because there's a picture of a horse, the kid says pony and the teacher says, that's right. Yeah, that's right. The object that the word is describing may be a pony, but the word itself is horse. The word is what's in question here, not what it's describing. Anyway, the phonics versus whole language debate goes all the way back to the 19th century when this fellow by the name of Horace Mann, the Massachusetts Board of Education. Remember we discussed Massachusetts? They were the first state to have public education, so they were doing a lot of thinking about education really early on. This is a quote from Research and the Reading Wars by James S. Kim. Now, he says, Mann excoriated the letters of the alphabet as bloodless, ghostly apparitions and argued that children should first learn to read whole words. That's, pretty dramatic, but I see, maybe, kind of dramatic. Anyway, in 1886, a man called Cattell used the new science of eye movements to show that people read words faster than letters. Science. So now they have scientific evidence to support whole word learning. Now, someone living in 1890 would say that the science says whole word is the proper way to teach reading. 140 years later, we know that the science says the opposite. So science changes. Science! It's not some all-powerful God. It changes. Now, later in the 1940s, a man called William Gray wrote a book called On Their Own Reading, in which he told teachers to teach whole word and to avoid phonics drills. This book became very influential in reading circles. Cut forward a few years later, 1960s, the debate was between phonics and look-say, as they called whole word learning. Rudolf Flesch came out with a book called Why Johnny Can't Read. I love that title. Kids these days, says every generation ever. Later, in 1967, Jean Schall had extensive research that showed that phonics was superior. She wrote a book called Learning to Read, The Great Debate. But whole language had its supporters. See, this is the problem with academic theories, is that there are people who have built careers on these theories. They have a professional stakes in seeing their theories win out. So it becomes personal for them. Phonics was again challenged by psychologist Frank Smith, who said that reading was like learning to speak. It is not. But Smith was good at marketing his theories. He started making instruction manuals for teachers, and he started recommending things to policymakers. So he was just better at PR. In the 1970s, these theories were again tested using science. Science! Psychologist Keith Stanovich found that it was poor readers who needed context clues and that good readers had word recognition from earlier experience. So practice. But that's not what made it into the classroom. The scientists didn't have the outreach that whole language proponents did. They didn't have that PR. Systems were developed around whole language. Now, because kids are taught to look for cues as to the meaning, the system taught was called cueing, and it's become very popular among teachers. Politics is everywhere. It's not just Washington. Politics is everywhere. It's at your job's HR department. It is everywhere. It's in academia. It's in academia a lot. A lot of people will complain about the politics of academia. The teaching colleges also did not interact with the colleges that studied these things and researched reading. They seems like they should have, but they just didn't. Teachers are now saying, in 2024, that they were never taught phonics in teaching school. But this research has been around for many generations. So what gives? Anyway, in the 1980s, the state of California adopted the whole language approach. It was sold to the state legislature as a grassroots movement which empowered teachers. These are a bunch of buzzwords that we should now know to look out for. I'm not saying they're always bad, but when you hear empowerment, just be like, what do you mean by that? What do you mean empower? What do you mean by that specifically? Spell it out. Spell it out for me. Now, this California curriculum had whole language textbooks, and the state actually banned state money from going towards purchasing spelling books. Which is weird to me because any book can be a spelling book with the right mindset, but that's beside the point. Anyway, I just think this is hilarious because not only can our generation not spell, but our parents couldn't spell either. I feel that if the squiggly red line were to go away, half of us would be functionally illiterate. Another funny thing, which is also beside the point, someone said that the kids say Riz because they can't spell charisma, and that had me cracking up because I don't know the research to say that that is true, but yeah, it is, isn't it? Anyway, back to the reading wars. Now, this whole language curriculum focused on what the children wanted. They believed that children should be constructing their own reading knowledge organically. They didn't teach kids the 26 letters or the 44 sounds. And parents who know their kids, they complained that the literature that the kids were getting, that they were just supposed to naturally know how to read, was too difficult for their kids to actually read. No one listened. No one listened until 1992 when 52% of fourth graders tested below grade level. In 1994, that number was even less. California was a huge experiment in whole language and it failed. Bill Honig, who was the California Commissioner of Education at that time in the 80s and he put the program into place, he had to admit that the program was not based on any proof. It was like just vibes, man. Now, this huge failure led to new legislation requiring phonics instruction. Now, the federal government also stepped in. The federal government obviously has an interest in making sure that kids can read. Congress asked for a report on the best way to educate children. And in 2000, they got a conclusive report which said that, yes, phonics was better. Early intervention with phonics instruction could actually prevent reading failure. So basically that's like if a kid can't read well, if he can't read fluently, if he can't read by the third grade, he or she may struggle with reading their entire life. It's a problem. You have to intervene early. Now, this information formed the basis of the Reading First program, which was a big part of George W. Bush's No Child Left Behind policy. And this was actually a good plan. He did something good. Now, side note, do you remember what George W. was reading on 9/11 in the classroom when he was reading My Pet Goat?
Sound it out, get ready. Kids. Sound it out, get ready. Kids. What word? Kids. Yes.
That was an example of the phonics curriculum that he was advocating in his program. See, we thought it was some skull and bones ritual, but no, it was actually part of his reading program. We need our child sacrifices to be literate people. Can we have some standards? The gods won't take just anything. Now, I think it's funny, kind of like dark funny, that Professor Kim ends his chapter with, finally, the research prevailed and policymakers did the right thing. End of scene, moving on. We won this battle, guys. No. Reading First gave out funding to schools for phonics programs. Now, an investigation later found that there was favoritism at play as to who they were giving the contracts to. And that's corruption, straight up corruption. It doesn't have anything to do with phonics, but it's corruption. Just your standard corruption, though. Nothing fancy. Anyway, Reading First had its funding cut. And then later in 2008, a study found that Reading First both worked and didn't work. There was no impact on reading comprehension tests, but students were able to decode words better. And also, many teachers were against Reading First because it was a conservative talking point. It was conservative versus liberal. They felt that it took agency away from teachers and forced an authoritarian style of teaching. And, for some people, everything is about left-right politics. If George W. Bush was for it, they were going to be against it. It's clouded a lot of people's judgment. And yes, phonics versus whole language kind of does show the difference between conservative and liberal ideology. Phonics means that the kids sit down and they learn exactly what they're told. There are 26 letters and there are 44 sounds and there is no wiggle room. Phonics is structured and whole language kind of like goes with the flow. Whole language means that kids can succeed without an authority figure telling them what to do, even if that authority figure is a teacher. That reading is somehow within them and that they just need the tools to get it out. Think how conservatives view order and goodness as something that needs to be taught and ingrained in people. It does not come naturally to us, and therefore we need strict rules. Whereas liberals, they think that goodness and order is intrinsic, and we just need help pulling it to the surface. I don't know about all that, but the science says that reading is not naturally in us. As far as goodness and order goes, it's anyone's guess. But for reading, conservatives are right on this one. This is why politics doesn't belong everywhere. It should have just been about reading from the start. So Kim, he leaves off hopeful, and Hanford picks up about a decade later, much more cynical. Whole language is back, and it's called balanced literacy. Balanced literacy. In theory, balanced literacy is meant to teach both whole language and phonics, but in practice, it teaches mostly whole language. It teaches the cueing system. Children are given books to read, but they are not taught how to read. They're told to look for cues as to what the word means, but not how to read the word, not how to decode the word. Now, look, I'll be honest. Cueing theory is fine for rich kids and for middle-class kids. Their parents will get them a private tutor or teach them themselves. It does not work for poor kids because it doesn't work. It doesn't work for rich kids either, but that doesn't really matter, does it? Because their parents will just spend a little bit more money. That's all. And then, now here's the rub. And then poor kids don't learn how to read. And people think that they're poor because they're slow and not that they are slow because they are poor. That's sad. Anyway, Emily Hanford talks about a middle-class mother who confronted the teacher that failed to teach her daughter how to read. Seidenberg, this is a researcher she's mentioned in her article. Seidenberg knows of a child who was struggling so much with reading that her mother paid for a private tutor. The tutor taught her some of the basic skills that the child wasn't getting in her whole language classroom, he said. At the end of the school year, the teacher was proud that the child had made so much progress, and the parent said, "Well, why didn't you teach phonics or other basic skills related to print in class?" And the teacher said, "Oh, I did. Your child was absent that day." Wow. So balanced literacy really isn't very balanced. It seems that it's weighted against poor kids and kids from single parent homes whose mother or father doesn't have time to teach them how to read. Sad. Now, the Sold the Story podcast is great because it goes into detail about the people who championed whole language or cueing or balanced literacy, who made their names off of it and paid their mortgage out of it. Textbooks are an industry. These learning programs make people a lot of money. I mean, also, some of these academics and teaching instructors, they're not really bad people. They really believed in what they were doing. They were just wrong. They just happened to be wrong. Now, some of the big names in whole language are Marie Clay, who was kind of the Svengali for these whole language teachers. She had a program called Reading Recovery. Later, Irene Fountas and Sugay Pinnell marketed a program called Guided Reading. And they did this in 2001, so long after the science had supposedly been settled. The Guided Reading program didn't explicitly prohibit phonics, but it taught that phonics was not needed. Teachers could do word work, which is basically phonics, in a pinch, but it wasn't necessary, they said. It is necessary. Anyway, and yes, their programs made them a lot of money. The people who come up with these programs, they make money. The people who manufacture and distribute these programs, they make money. School systems buy boxes and boxes of these books, whether the teacher wants them or not the teacher's call. And for this, the best case scenario is that the teachers leave those books sitting in the back of the classroom, still in the boxes. There are teacher conferences too. Early childhood education is a massive, massive industry. And that's not including teacher salary and classroom maintenance, which we gladly pay for out of our tax dollars. But a lot of these other things, we're like, hey, what is all this? Why is this taking up so much money? So is this a great conspiracy to keep our children uneducated and make a lot of money in the process? Well, not exactly, because nothing's really that interesting. Defenders of balanced literacy will say that, yes, it works, and they do teach phonics as part of their curriculum. This educator called Lucy Calkins has a program called Units of Study, which uses balanced literacy to teach kids how to read. Now, to her credit, she has revised her program to meet the science. Now, in this opinion piece that she wrote in her defense, she says this: "My curriculum, Units of Study in Reading, Writing, and Phonics, is a curriculum that has been continually developed and refined for 40 years, informed by classroom-based research, by rich assessments of students, and by scholarship. The approach would never have been adopted in approximately 25% of the nation's schools if it didn't yield results. It is the curriculum in a huge number of blue ribbon and beat the odds schools. The data overwhelmingly indicates that schools partnering with us demonstrate meaningful improvement in students' performance, and that improvements only deepen over time." She blames the media and sensationalism for whipping up a frenzy over the nation's kids. Does she have a point? Well, I'm not a teacher of young children. I do teach on YouTube, but we're adults. You can argue that millennials are still kind of children, but we pay taxes and we're taller. Look, we're not storming any beaches. I'm just going to say that. But we're technically adults. But I am not a teacher of young children. I'm just going to look at the data. Anyway, looking at the data, it basically says that reading scores haven't changed in 30 years. It hasn't changed much in 30 years. It went up slightly after a while and then dipped again after COVID. And does that slight improvement have to do with the curriculum, or could it be better explained with a decrease in teenage mothers, teenage pregnancies, and a massive influx of cash in the economy because of the internet? And it was also not a significant improvement. So I'm just going to throw this out there. It's just an idea. I don't even know if I believe it. I'm just saying it. What if half these kids are just dumb as okay? What if half these kids are dumb? Reading first didn't work. Balanced literacy didn't work. What if half these kids are just not Space Force material? Okay, that's okay. That's okay, because the Army is hiring too. And you know by about 8 years old if your kid is Space Force or Army. Are they using those Legos to build the Millennium Falcon, or are they showing up their noses? Let's be serious, and we could save ourselves a lot of tax dollars. I'm just saying. I know there's people in comments like, oh, you're so mean. That's a mean thing to say. Thank God you're not a teacher. Well, I also thank God I'm not a teacher, just looking at these results. But those people typing that, defending their kids, they have Legos up their noses right now. Them and their 8-year-old sitting right next to them, both Legos up their noses. Just stop being in people's comment section and go cook some chicken nuggets, leave people alone. Anyway, unnecessary diatribe. I did some polling of my audience, my beloved audience, and they do tend to be smarter than the average bear because of the nature of my videos. And you all had some great responses to how you learned how to read and when. Some of you just picked it up naturally, and some of you remember explicitly being taught. I thought that was really cool. I did another poll and asked how many of you still read regularly, seeing if there was some problems with people who learn how to read late and people who continue to read. And about half of you don't read anymore. You don't read regularly anymore. Now, these are not scientific polls, of course not, but I think it shows that there is a long-term trend against reading, even by people who know how to read. So how it's going to affect the children who can't read, I don't know. That's another video. I just found that was really interesting. So you let me know in the comments, how did you learn how to read? Were you taught phonics, or you just kind of pick it up naturally? And how are you teaching your kids? Oh yeah, you better be teaching your kids, because the schools certainly aren't doing it. Anyway, thank you, like, share, and subscribe.